We're going to continue the conversation now and talk a little bit more about the possible solutions for all of this. So I'm still joined by Scott Pelto and Rob McMullan. Scott, solutions. You were mentioning.
So you know, the ultimately the solution is to take responsibility, but you know we've got to put some meat around that so we understand what it means. The analogy I was given before about the family and the broader community, you know, families do tend to operate in maybe a socialist authoritarian manner because the children are too young. They're not at the age of responsibility. We raise them to become independent and move on. Now, when you move outside the family and into the community, you know, that's where we start to, we have reciprocal cooperation for exchanging products between people, which is the economy. And that economy is where we move maybe from that socialist family model, you know, into more of a capital model, because we know that capital works and we participate in this environment in a responsible way. It's the essence of competition. If people aren't responsible, they're not going to be a party, you know, to the model.
And that's how capitalism works.
Yeah, and this is why I talk about putting limits on government and the importance of voluntarism. So government is not a voluntary thing that anybody participates with. You know, we have to have it, but we have to understand that its role and its responsibility is limited. So I've heard you many times, you know, talk about the ABC and the government will fix it. Frankly, the government is not responsible for fixing it, Damien. We are.
Yeah, and we have to accept it.
We the people. Yeah. You know, and if we hold to the value of freedom...
But nobody wants to hear that. We all want to hear that the government's going to fix it. You know, mummy and daddy are going to step in and make everything better, and then I don't have to take personal responsibility. That's an incredibly appealing proposition to take to the electorate if you're a Green politician and you want to win votes.
But in doing so, we diminish our future, because that's what the responsibility is about. It's about, you know, ensuring and improving our future. So, you know, a quick example on numbers and where the government's responsibility lines are at the moment. We did the exercise on trying to work out, which is not easy, as you know, how much money governments in Australia spent in last year, 2023. The best source that I could find for that was the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Yep. Bring it all together and aggregate the number to that's spending of all governments in the country, 916,550 million. So just short of $1 trillion.
That's a lot more than we take in tax. Government revenue is not that much. It's only about 600. Right?
Correct. So
oops.
So you know, we fund that with debt.
Yeah.
Now, and you know, just to be clear on that debt, because it's another thing.
That's printing money.
Well, it's another thing that the left talk about all the time, like forgive the debt and debt redistribution. Governments take on debt by issuing treasury bonds, you know, to people like maybe someone in your family. They might say, you know, Mrs. McMullan, would you like to take a $10,000 treasury bond, as in you give me $10,000, the government, now I've got $10,000, and I'll give you all these sensationally favourable terms, you know, in terms of a yield on that bond and a guarantee of repayment, you know, when the bond matures. So
you get interest. You lend them 10 grand. You lend the government 10 grand. They give you a bit of paper. That's the bond.
Yep.
And that's a guarantee that they're going to give you that 10 grand back and the interest.
And I'm now the government with this mounting debt, which is owed to, you know, a person in Australia or a person in another country if they bought those bonds. So if we're to forgive this debt, if I'm not to repay it...
Who's doing the forgiving?
I'm not going to give your wife $10,000 back.
Yeah, it's not the government doing the forgiving, it's your wife.
Under contracted terms, you know, it's immature and, you know, ideological and
childish
extreme
again.
To say that you can forgive debt.
Now let's just to elaborate on that for a little bit. Of course, if you don't pay it back this time, what happens next time, and what happens to your debt, what happened? Well, she's going to expect a much bigger interest rate if you go back a month later and say, hey, I need another $10,000.
Well, your credit worthiness decreases enormously.
So your AAA rating goes down to a double B minus.
In natural law terms, you decrease the incentive to cooperate.
Correct.
Yeah, right. decreasing the incentive to cooperate.
This is why I
helps
say
productivity.
that governments have a fiduciary relationship with the people that put them in those powers. When I talk about governments, I talk about politicians and the bureaucracy, because the politicians are supposed to represent us and control the bureaucracy. Otherwise, it will get out of control because they don't, freely participate in a competitive environment.
Yeah.
The money just comes to them because of the coercive, requirement for the people to give it.
Yeah, so that's stealing, or we would have called that stealing once. I don't think, obviously Jonathan Sriranganathan from the Greens, and a lot of the Greens are very comfortable with the idea of stealing because they've actually promoted shoplifting from Coles and Woolies, as we said earlier in the show.
Well, that's disrespecting other people.
Yeah,
that's what it
is. It's disrespecting other people. It's not taking personal responsibility. So stealing's bad, we know that. And also not paying back your dets is bad, right?
Once
Gotta pay
again,
your debts
you're just, as I said, actively reducing the incentive to cooperate. So and cooperation, as we've talked about very extensively, is productive, the most productive way. So you're decreasing the productivity of society. So what you're actually doing is you're just being, in the moment, a pack of locusts, consuming the systems that create the excess wealth to redistribute to you in the first place.
So this talking about where it goes, and this is really what concerns me, is we're diminishing the future for our descendants, for all of our children.
We're wrecking the system. It's the entropy factor.
We're consuming civilizational capital.
And so what happens, when we do that, I talk about this fiduciary responsibility that government has as they take, what they take in an involuntary manner. It means that they have an absolute obligation to spend the absolute minimum that can be spent, because people aren't volunteering, that effort, because money, captures effort that they made. People aren't volunteering this, they're taking it.
And we're constantly seeing governments say, look, we won't spend that much, we're going to hold back, we're going to be responsible. We never see that.
Well, back to those numbers, Damien. So the gross domestic product, if that is a reasonable measure, in Australia in 2023 was 1.68 trillion. So think about the spending versus the product and who it is that's doing the spending in this case. Because when you spend, it's also, like we've discussed previously, it's important to spend on operating expenses and also capital, which is a provision for the future. So if we've got a government spending more than half of all of the product, so that's not individuals investing, that's the government, as they decree, spending that money, then that puts our future in a poor position.
So we've got government spending $916 billion
almost
a year.
$1 trillion
a year. We've got tax coming in from the productive, value-creating part of our society. That tax is taken from them. It's coming in at $600 billion a year.
Yeah.
And we have accumulated debt, so that gap is $300 billion roughly.
Yeah, continual
That's
borrowing.
accumulated to a debt now across all of our state and federal governments of about 1.68, did you say?
That's the GDP.
Oh, sorry, that's our gross
production.
domestic product, which is a
Yeah.
whole other thing. Okay, so sorry,
but the
and
debt
the
the
debt's
debt's
about
o-
$1.5 trillion, I think, across all state and federal.
Yeah,
now.
correct.
I really hope some of our previous listeners are listening to the extended version of the show, because there's something very important here which they need to understand. Is I know from first-hand experience that a lot of the people in the Labor Party are looking now, because as we talked about the asymmetry of wealth held by the 55s and up, they do have, compared to 55s and down, a lot of wealth there. And the political forces know this. And I know for a fact, one thing they're going to be looking at is inheritance taxes to make up that shortfall. So what I'd like to say to a lot of people who have financial agency, political agency, the system will entropy and you'll be paying one way or another. You can pay to train people into responsibility on your own terms, or you cannot pay that cost to defensively lead people out of self-defense, or you can, not pay that cost and they'll go to the Greens and Labor and you'll be paying it another way.
Well,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
but when we talk
With your
about
boomer head on a stake.
when we talk about,
Oh, bring out the boomers.
Well,
I'll show my
they're
age.
going to go
now.
for it one way or
The
another.
mob are going to go here.
When we talk about big numbers, it just washes over people. They don't have a real connection with it. So I had an uncle that used to say, if you spoke about any big numbers, he'd say, well, that'd take a lot of chewing out and chewing gum, wouldn't it? So, you know, that's...
See, they're the people we need. We don't
correct.
have these men anymore.
It's
With
to
this wisdom.
It's to get your head around, you know,
right.
what makes up that big number.
Yeah.
You know, or he would say, well, it's not much if you say it fast, is it? You know, so people
it's
bring.
Should we take the zeros off there?
Yeah.
Basically, we're spending $916 every year, and we're only earning $600 a year.
So that
and our debt's currently $1,500.
well, to make it real for people, Damien, I would say this. You know, I looked up. Australia's got a population of 27 million people.
Yeah.
I looked up how many of those were between 18 and 65, because in theory they're the ones that could contribute to government spending, whether they do or not. So you're slightly under 18 million people for 916 billion of expenditure. Per person, per head, that comes down to about $51,000 for every person.
Per year.
So your contribution to all of the government activity was $51,000, even though you didn't give them $51,000 in tax, you know, direct taxes, but they spent the money requiring a contribution
I'll
from
just
you.
say, I'm feeling that weight on my shoulders very presciently.
Same with you, Damien.
Not a small business, you're feeling it.
You're feeling
every
it.
day.
You're feeling it, yeah, that is true.
there you
It is
go.
The
true.
point is this, and the point is, you know, people individually, you know, being able to own their destiny instead of the government spending their destiny. So individually, if we peeled that back, it's almost impossible to say, but if you took a stab at it and said, well, let's just spend money on what we must spend money, and everything that would be nice, we don't spend money on. You know, could we bring that $51,000 contribution from you back to, say, $25,000? I think that is entirely within the realms of possibility.
God, you could actually create a job for somebody and hire somebody.
That's the thing.
What that means, Rob, is if you're in a family of four, you know, with 4 people over 18 and under $65,000, you've now brought back into your control $25,000 each. That's $100,000 that your little family unit every single year, and this is real. You know, it sounds unreal, but it's real money, and it's a real scenario.
I like the way you said that, you know, bring it back under your control, because that's essentially what it is, right? The economy, this is what I don't think people on the left understand. The economy has a fixed amount of value in it at any given point in time, right? It has the potential to be big.
Well, we can only produce so much.
Right, so there it is. There's the pie, okay? Now, either you're giving a proportion of that to the government. If you increase taxes, then all you're doing is shifting that piece of the pie, the control of that piece of the pie, from the business person, the productive person, to the government.
And
now,
wage earners.
who would you rather run stuff? The person who actually has had to learn to build a business and learn to take risk and learn from trial and error and have, or some bureaucrat sitting in a government office.
Well,
I'd rather keep it with the person who knows how to create value.
Well, sure, but it also stays with a family of 4 people who are all wage earners, because, you know, it's when I said 51,000, that's per person, no matter if you're a business person or a wage earner. So you've got $100,000 now. Imagine that, it's real money. Under your control, if we could do this, if we could peel, you know, government expenditure, you know, down to just what is necessary, that's $100,000 this year, next year, the year after, where you can now start to say, well, what would I do with that? Would I spend some of it? Would I save some of it? You know, which is the purpose of money. If you did save it, you wouldn't want inflation diminishing, you know.
No, so you'd have a vested interest in
the
it.
value of your pie. So you save it, and then you do things with it. You know, maybe you open up opportunity for yourself and you chase your own destiny. Maybe you create something that you can transfer to your children. You know, in the process of doing that, you teach them, they learn from it. It's a far more responsible, far better outcome than effectively outsourcing responsibility, which is what we do.
But the left would say you can't, people won't take responsibility, Scott. They'll spend that money on, trash television, trash movies and Hello. So this would bring me to you, Rob, I guess, and the idea of, that sense, that adulthood.
Look,
versus being a child, right? And taking that
right.
responsibility and
I think the long-term view is if people don't ever suffer consequences, they don't grow up. And
we've had a very luxury position.
We have had a luxury position, and what I really want to push forward as I think my central message to viewers is if you have means, whether it's intellectual, financial, even time, whatever way you can, we need people to be taking responsibility for younger people and showing them better ways and, trying to mentor and incentivize them into small business. I'm very passionate about small business because I know that from my personal story, when you work in a small business, you have lunch with the boss. He'll have a coffee and he'll tell you how it runs, and you have the ability to learn in a way that you don't working, in a large corporate. You're not face to face often with the guy who calls the shots, who's got access to the bank accounts, who runs the actual business. And so for my personal story is, for me, it was a way to learn what, undo the misinformation I learned at university and in school, and to work my way out of a fairly disadvantaged financially background and become a responsible person. And the middle class is often more moral because they're the ones face to face all the time with reciprocal cooperation. You have a degree of parasitic elites and you have a degree of a parasitic dependent class. But the middle class is where people are more responsible and closest face to face with reciprocity.
Well, I've been saying for a while now that I really don't like the terms left and right. I don't like dividing people. It's not conducive to reciprocal cooperation when you divide people. And I have this.
I apologise, but there's no. I mean, it's the,
no,
it's the easy shortcut way of saying, those who seek large government is the left. Those who seek small government.
Well, I have this core belief that that fundamentally, the majority of people all want the same thing. We all share a similar destiny. Now we certainly vary on the fringes, and all people have competing interests, but we're also all people, and we all fundamentally need the same thing. And so my pitch, in talking about an alternative, better future, like the future for us, for people on Earth, could be stunning, could be absolutely stunning. The way we've progressed, the abilities, that people have, there's almost anything imaginable we could take, provided that we understand that we have to make sacrifices, that we have to suffer through the journey to get there. But in doing so, there's meaning. There's meaning in that journey.
And learning.
And if instead of outsourcing that destiny, which again we capture the value of that in money, and if we kept that with individuals, so it's not about the money, it's about keeping that value that you can do something with in the future instead of outsourcing it. And if we did that and brought it in, who knows what we could achieve?
Exactly.
Who knows?
The problem is that we're killing small business at the moment. We're squeezing small business in between big government and big corporations. And big government and big corporations are in fact colluding, I think, and this is where the problem is with big capital, because the left like gigantism, right? And they want that centralised control and that centralised power. What's happened in Australia that hasn't happened in other countries is that we have compulsory superannuation. And that is feeding this massive superannuation industry. And then you have industry super funds, which are tied to unions, and they are making the demands on all these social things like ESG and DEI, and they're basically redirecting capital into leftist politics, leftist political causes, which is inefficient, but also means that we're shifting again to the left, the culture. And so, the traditional sort of capital resources for the right, for conservatism, for individual promotion of individual values, traditional conservative or right wing or centre right values, classical liberal values of small business, that's all disappearing. That money's not there anymore.
Oh, there's
because government's colluding with, now small business, how do they collude? How do they squeeze small business? Regulation, right? You put regulation on a small bit. You say, oh, you've got to have this safety regulation, or you've got to have this new definition of what a part-time worker is versus a casual worker, because it all makes perfect sense. Oh, wonderful if you, in theory, and wonderful if you're a big corporation with a great big budget and you've got a big legal department. But if you're a small business person, that takes another 2 hours of your day or your week away, and you get less time with your family, and you get run into the ground, and you don't want to run a small business anymore, and you want to retire on the beach like so many men over 50 are doing, in particular men, I'm sorry, women too, but definitely. And so we're losing those father figures, those mentors, those people that would traditionally be there, because they're not getting supported by anybody. So I think we're really in trouble, because the big capital, big corporations, and big government are working together to get that power and lord it over everybody else. And I just don't see how we get out of this mess. I'm a bit depressed.
I would say these are moves in fundamental economic models. One is a socialist model, one is a capitalist model. And everything, I don't think we have to make a case. I think it's self-evident that the shift, the direction that the Western world is heading into is away from capitalism and towards socialism. We do not have a pure capital model, not now.
No, but how do you avoid the Peter Hitchens mentality, which is, I give up, it's all a disaster, we're all going to fall to pieces?
What you have to do...
Take responsibility.
Yep, and another aspect of that is men need to insure each other. See, men also have a very toxic behaviour of throwing other men under the bus for their own status. And you find that a lot too. A lot of men are like, well, if I can promote DEI and it screws over a lot of other people in small business, but I get to funnel that profit to me, I'm doing just great. I'm doing just great. But rights and defense of rights and defense of the civilization that we want is only possible with mutual insurance. And this is part of the West too, in terms of mutual defense of sovereign interests, and it develops back from, right back in Europe, where it's like we're all these tribes and towns, but we have agreements to mutually defend each other. Someone gets attacked, we all go there, but we're still sovereign. We have our sovereign interests. We're sovereign over our own little towns and things. We've got
NATO.
Well,
we've got an agreement. Anyway.
It's just an idea that we have to mutually, reciprocally defend each other's sovereign interests.
Which I would say, I think voluntary of all people is key to anything we move to. If we can't do it in a voluntary way, we can't do it. You cannot get buy-in from people, and you cannot, march in a solid direction unless those people are voluntarily doing it, which is the essence of reciprocal cooperation.
That's right.
So however the solution is presented, it's got to be, people have to be convinced that it's in their best interest.
Personally, I'm speaking to a very small percentage of the population, because a few small people well organised can create a big splash.
Yep.
There are a few great organisations out there. Obviously, the Libertarians are doing a really good job. They're great people. There's another organisation I've been following, the British Australian community. There's a few organisations out there that are ready and willing to do good work, and a few people getting behind them and supporting them goes a long way. But, it doesn't seem like there's anyone with a huge burning incentive to defend our civilization. Like I said, a lot of the elites are happy to profit on the way down. They're happy to profit on its transition into socialist structure.
Probably because they're okay and they haven't passed on the knowledge.
We haven't even touched on climate change, but yeah, climate change is a whole other area that really plays on that.
If
right?
nobody defends a thing, it will not persist. Yeah. That's the truth. And so what I'm saying out there is, if you're listening to this, invest in your civilization if you want it to continue.
Well, there's the old saying that the way that evil prospers and goes forward is for good people to stand by and let it happen.
Absolutely.
That's how it happens. And this, I think it's important to understand, the history of socialism and where it came from and where it can go to. So, which starts with Karl Marx, a German economic philosopher from 1890. So you've got to, go back
to... Didn't bathe, apparently. Bit of a stinker.
You got to go back to that time period, and he wrote two books. He wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Capitalism, in the way to tear down capitalism. That Communist Manifesto provides a roadmap of what is required to tear down the capital system, and you can pretty much see it playing out right now, that roadmap.
Well, and that was taken by the the German group that I was talking about earlier, who
well, I think people need to understand this
at the
as
Goethe
well.
University.
So, to me, the culmination of everything that ever went wrong in the world, the absolute breakdown of reciprocal cooperation, was World War II. That was the breakdown of it.
Yeah.
And then understand that the three people, who at least headed the groups, you've got Hitler, you've got Mussolini,
Stalin.
and Hirohito. Stalin and Lenin, were also terrible socialists who killed tens of millions of their own people. But it was those three groups, that wanted to progress against everybody else. And then understand the background of those people. So, Hitler, started as a socialist politician. The Nazi party is the National Socialist Workers' Union in Germany. Mussolini started as a socialist politician, and Mussolini created fascism. And fascism, as I understand the root of the words, is to bind together. And in binding together, it's what you were talking about before, where you bind large corporations and government and the media, as the third source, to bind them together to, it's under the guise of nationalism for those individuals at the expense of others to move forward.
Which is why we're actually seeing the fascism come out of the left.
Hirohito, the same thing. So you've got to understand where this, shift to authoritarianism, which happens because we devolve responsibility and say, you take it, instead of us taking it.
Could I make a point on that? I would actually debate that Karl Marx was an economist. I think he's better.
That's actually
framed.
true.
Well, I think it's better framed as communism is actually more framed as a religion and a cult religion. The central idea of Marxism is and all forms of Marxism as it's evolved through the ages, is a false promise of freedom from the laws of nature.
It's a lie.
It's a lie, but specifically it's a false promise of freedom from the laws of nature. In that Marxism was a false promise that we can be free of scarcity. And we can't, because it's a law of nature.
Yeah, I see.
And as it's evolved, the race Marxists have very openly taken to whatever they want to define as attacking white people, and they're selling their followers, their cult followers, a freedom, a utopia after whiteness. The feminists, the hardcore ones, will sell their followers a false promise of utopia after men.
That's what
And
an
the neo-Nazis are utopia after Jews. And then you've got
that's right.
But yeah,
So
it just goes on and on.
But it's the same formula repackaged in a lot of ways,
Utopia after carbon.
Well, if
But we get rid of after net zero.
but
Net zero
Marx
anyway.
promised freedom from scarcity, but it's not possible. So that's why it doesn't work.
I would say to the listeners, we're talking about a solution, I would say this: read history, understand economics. I agree with you, Marx wasn't an economist, but he was a philosophical, economist. He then gave rise to Keynesianism. And the central tenet of Keynesianism.
Yeah, let's not talk about Keynesian.
It's
But,
aggregate
it's run economics for like the last
Isn't that
100 years.
Isn't that a false promise?
It's
that money needs to be tied to real value.
Well, it's the idea that you can do, you can stimulate the economy by just printing more money, and that's the whole problem, and why we've got modern monetary theory.
Think
It's a
about what
division.
we're against in this education thing. So, the universities are owned and controlled by governments and bureaucrats. Keynesian economics is what is taught at university.
But this is I think we've defined the problem, guys. We know why Australia's in trouble, why Australia's in crisis. The solution, I guess, is men have got to step up.
Correct.
Women have got to step up. We've got to be more mentoring. We've got to be more. Capital has got to step up in a big way and stop supporting
just
the
think
left and woke
critically.
ideas.
I'll put something else out there, and this is going to be controversial. Two things. Do you want me to be controversial?
It's going to be more controversial. It's going to be more controversial. Hey, wait on for a minute. Here we go. Drum
Back
roll,
on
please.
to...
If you do a
looking
gender
at-
thing on me, we're going to be.
No, I'm not going to do a gender thing, because
YouTube.
Let's cut to Max Chandler Mather, our Greens
Okay.
MP and the seat of Griffith.
We have to wrap up, so make it quick.
Okay, so we're talking about false.
We're talking Brisbane here. Max Chandler Mather is an inner city Brisbane federal member of parliament that was elected. We didn't have Teals in Brisbane, so we got a lot of Greens in the inner city instead of Teals. Go ahead.
So we're talking about false promise.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Rob was the candidate for the UAP in that particular electorate that was beaten by Max Chandler Mather.
Right.
So,
I ran against two very well-trained Marxists, Max Chandler Mather and the incumbent was Terry Butler. And what you find, Labor Party, Greens and Labor Party. So I saw a clip recently of Max saying property handouts, I think what's the phrase he's using, or investor handouts. He keeps using his word handout. And I came to understand that what he's talking about is, there's a basic reciprocity that if the government wants to take a part of your profits when a business makes money, it's just reciprocity that you'll get a tax deduction if you lose money. But claiming a tax deduction, Max is reframing, lying, calling that a handout. Mm. But it's just a lie.
The power of language and words.
That's right.
Yeah,
and so
Goebbels was very good at language.
Goebbels was the guy on language and words, and they do it so well.
But the problem is it works for their base. It works really well, and for younger people who aren't told otherwise, it would be very easy for me to get up there and say, money represents value. If I do work, the work is the value, the good or service.
Yeah.
So
money's just a representation of that.
That's right. So if the money gets taken from that good or service and given to someone else who didn't do that work, that is the definition of a handout. But if I do work and lose value because my business has legitimate tax deductions, that is literally not a handout, it's a tax deduction. But he wants to equate, because being left-wing, he wants to justify handouts to his base, the consumption to his base, by equating, saying, we can take from all these corporates because they have illegitimate profits because they rely on handouts anyway. So basically, he's just lying.
They're all going to pack up and go home. That's what they're going to do.
Well, the point,
going to give up.
Point is, though, he's lying.
Yeah.
Very brazenly.
Yeah.
And another clip that's very famous from Terry Butler talking to Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson saying, well, in a democracy, women do have political agency. And she said, well, no, they don't because they're not represented in Parliament. He said, how can they not be represented in Parliament? They vote for representatives like everyone else. And so she did a category lie by saying that the assumption she didn't say but implied was that a woman can only be adequately represented in Parliament by another woman. Which if she voiced that axiom, that implication, you'd pick it apart as absurd. Because men and women can vote for whoever they want. But she lied, and Jordan Peterson responded to that by saying, I don't understand your question. Of course he doesn't, because she's just lying. Mm. She's lying to bait him into a situation of looking silly to her base. I mean, to someone who knows, she looks silly because she's just lying.
Yeah.
But what do you think about this? In matters of the public, from a public position, when talking to the public, politicians should not be able to lie, like legally, not be able to brazenly lie.
Well, I think you'd be imposing government force over people, and then you have the horrible situation that we have with the problem with the freedom of speech, which is that you have to have someone arbitering, you have to have someone deciding what a lie is and what a lie isn't. And I just think in our current situation...
Do you think that there's a lot that you could easily
Yes, I think there's objective truth. I don't believe in relativism, of course. So I do think there are things that you can point out and go, that's a blatant lie.
I mean, is it reciprocity for people to be lied to by politicians?
Well, it's not fully exhaustively informed.
That's right. So you can speak in testimonialism, I believe, and my best understanding is this. But when Max Chandler says they're getting a handout, it's just a brazen lie.
Yeah, it's PR spin though, and I think people would say,
it's not a spin. It's a lie.
Okay, I agree with you. No, I agree with you, but I'm just saying, it's the use of language, the manipulation of language, which is something that the left has done very well. What concerns me is when they shift debates completely, and you find yourself debating. So they do the trick of I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but. Well, I guess, debating whether or not we should say the welcome to country instead of debating the very fundamental essence of the idea of Indigenous people, right? So we've shifted the debate. So we now will accept this. and you get your opponents to accept things by moving the debate to the next level and getting them to argue about that. And the underlying assumption is the previous thing, you know what I mean? So you're taking it to, and that's a real sneaky thing the left does all the time.
Well, they abuse language.
Yeah.
And they conflate.
Yep.
And this is the no-win
I
situation.
mean, the right do too, but not to the extent, not as well and not as sophisticated a way as the left are doing at the moment.
No.
But anyway.
The left, once again, it's part of that empathy brain, system brain. They live in the world of language and perception, and they're masters of it.
I see. So it's more.
They can craft public perception like we can build an aeroplane.
Yeah.
They're different.
Guys, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm sorry we can't go on forever, but we can't. So we've got to wrap it up. It's been more than an hour, but it's flown by. Thank you so much, Scott Pelto, for joining us on the other side. And thank you, Rob McMullan, for coming in.
Pleasure.
Guys, I hope we see a lot more of you in the future on the show.
Absolutely.
Great to have these discussions, and we'll get you back to talk about other things in the near future, I hope.
All right. Thanks, Damien.
All right. Great. Good to have you with us, everybody. Thanks for staying for the extended version of this particular episode of The Other Side, our special off-the-set edition as we deep dive on the question of, is Australia in crisis? I don't know if we got too many answers. I think the answer is yes. The question is, how do we get out of it? I think we've got some good ideas out there anyway. So we'll catch you for our regular The Other Side, dropping every Friday, of course, our weekend show. And it's available on ADH.tv as well as many other platforms, but primarily ADH TV first and best place to watch the show. So do join us there, and all of the other great content on ADH TV is at your fingertips as well. ADH.tv on any browser, and you can download the app as well. We'll catch you really soon. Take care. Bye for now.